So hey, welcome to the podcast. My name is Josiah. I'm a Christian geoscientist, just graduated last June from a BS in geology at Oregon State University. One thing I'm really interested in as a Christian geoscientist is how faith and religion interplay with each other and science, and kind of exploring what the limits are for that and what the possibilities are, how they relate, if they relate at all. And I basically just kind of wanted to, not like force ideas on anybody. I'm not trying to convert anybody here. But I do want to kind of explore a few different religions and how they view science. First one here is my pastor, my church in Corvallis, Pastor Seth. And I'm just going to be asking him a few questions about how he views science as a Christian. And we'll see what we can find out from that. So, without further ado, this is Pastor Seth Trimmer. And
what's up?
First off, can you tell me a little bit about what your position is as a pastor?
Yeah, so I lead a community called Grace City Church, and I've been doing that for about 13 years or so now, just about. So I'm responsible for kind of the care and the oversight, direction, vision, as well as the teaching that happens in the community.
Nice.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you became a Christian and where you grew up, and a brief summary of how that story went down?
Yeah, well, I didn't grow up in a religious home of any kind, certainly not a Christian home. My parents both grew up with church backgrounds growing up, but abandoned them pretty much as soon as they could when they left for college. And for the most part, it wasn't a meaningful experience for them, at any point. It was very kind of traditional, Midwestern sort of just religious social clubs more than anything else, I think. It was about as much as I can understand. So my childhood grew up very absent of any theological discussion or conversation or explanation or context. So pretty much left just to the winds of just kind of Western culture and, whatever is just kind of the cultural way of kind of thinking, that happens, in a place like Corvallis, Oregon. When I went to college, I started to become very curious just because I didn't have a category for anything religiously, and I didn't know where I fit in the whole scheme of things. And I had a lot of questions about the bigger issues of life, the meaning of life, what happens after death, is there a God? If so, what does he expect of us, or what should we expect of him? Like those kind of general questions. And it was when I first started meeting Christians and then engaging in conversations with them that some of those itches started to get scratched. But I would say it wasn't until about my second year into university where my life was at a point of realizing not just the idea of God as being interesting, but it started to become much more of a personal reality and a necessity to me. And I realized that there was just a very absent gap in my life that only God could fill. And to me, the Christian message is what resonated in terms of God having become the one that bridged that gap to make a way to him possible, a relationship with him possible, and that's exactly what budded my sophomore year of college. So that's when my journey began, but it's certainly not where it's ended, and I've enjoyed almost 20 years now of knowing and growing in a relationship with God through Jesus, and it's informed through the Bible. So that's it's been a little bit of my journey. I can kind of bifurcate my life in terms of the first 20 years being completely ignorant and void of anything quote unquote spiritual or religious, and now the last 20 years being totally inundated in it. So I feel like that's been a unique gift that I've had in my life, to be able to see kind of both sides of the mountain from the top of the hill, so to speak, and be able to relate to people on both sides of that coin. And to me, even the scientific conversations and discussions, which for all intents and purposes was probably about as deep as I would go in terms of a worldview or a system of thought or belief, now is obviously incorporated into my life and worldview now, but just holds a different place in it. And so I can empathize with people who do and don't come from faith backgrounds, and then trying to reconcile the way in which, human accumulated knowledge, especially through the sciences, affects, how we understand the world and what the meaning of life and God and everything else is. So anyway, there you go. There's a little bit of my story.
Nice. Thank you. We're going to get into, the details of how you view science and the environment, but I wanted to ask you early on, kind of like, what was your experience with nature or the environment growing up? Was there anything that really stands out that, I don't know, told you anything or made nature or the environment meaningful to you in some way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if anyone in Oregon asks you that question explicitly, but it's just kind of assumed somewhere implicitly that you do have an encounter experience with it. I don't think I appreciated, I can definitely say that I didn't appreciate Oregon until I started traveling more in my late 20s and 30s, globally and even across the country, as much as I do now, which is pretty regular. And coming home to the Northwest it's just quite amazing. It's one of the most incredible places in the earth, to live. So, I would say that just the overwhelming sense of beauty that you almost get in 360 degrees, anywhere you look. And I think also just, you always hear the cliches about, maybe living in Southern California or different places where, the weather is quote unquote better, and for sure there's more sunshine, but I've always just had a deep appreciation for the holistic, climate and atmosphere and environment. I would get, for the most part, 4 seasons, at least close to it. But how just the gray and even the rain contributes to the reality of it being evergreen. And so, Oregon is perfect in the summer. It's just perfect. Like, there's nowhere else you want to be than, July or August in Oregon. But you have to pay for that, in January and February and so forth. So I think that, my just awareness of how all things kind of work together to contribute to beauty and to the harmony and the ecosystem. And, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but like, you're pretty much just been ingrained with the idea of environmentalism from preschool. I can remember here, so and that's not true everywhere else. Like to throw a aluminum can in the trash feels like a spiritual sin, violation, that anywhere I go somewhere outside of Oregon, people do all the time, and my heart almost leaps out of my chest, who's coming to arrest you right now? So just the awareness of the environment and the maintenance of it and the care for it, are stuff that's, those are things I actually, now it can go, maybe too far to get a little bit weird sometimes, but I just think comparatively to other places in the world, I love how much we care about that here. Yeah,
this is really good. And I want to kind of remind the audience, I guess. So Pastor Seth Trimmer is the pastor of Grace City Church in Corvallis, Oregon.
Yep.
That's where we're recording this. And for those that don't know, Corvallis is really cool because it's about an hour away from the beach, the west coast in Oregon, and then there's mountains also about an hour away on the other direction. We're in the Willamette Valley. It's super green. We get a lot of rain. Big agricultural place, a lot of green trees. Very beautiful. For context, Pastor Seth Trimmer, can you tell me kind of your view of science? How do you view science? What do you see as the role of science in society?
Yeah, I think something I'm happy to allow scientists to probably define more than I would. But as far as I understand it, that. I believe that humans were made in the image of God, and part of that means that we have responsibility as part of His creation to care for the rest of His creation. So I think we have a unique role in the earth. And I think that science is simply the idea that somehow, I believe it's connected to the image that God has placed in us, meaning just the uniqueness by which He's made us to be able to understand the world in which we live. To understand how the dynamics all come together, and then to be able to cause the world in which we live to flourish or to come to its full potential. And so to me, science is that knowing and growing in knowledge to be able to understand the world in which we live, to understand our part in it, and even how to somehow meaningfully participate in it, to actually pull it together to contribute to the ongoing journey of life and progression of life. So I think that would be like my starting place with the sciences. I don't know if I could go too much deeper than that, but that's about what I got. I know, but science obviously can branch out like so broadly into so many different fields and aspects. But I feel like that's where it would tie into my thinking.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on kind of one of the three things, or any of the three things here? Science and education is one. Professional scientists and how they do their job, I guess, is probably what most people think of as science. But then there's also like science in the news, science and media. Any thoughts on how those relate, I guess, or could relate to the Christian faith?
Yeah, well, I think there can be an underlying assumption for many that Christianity specifically, or religion generally, is like doesn't mix with the idea of science, that it's kind of an oil and water. It's an either or sort of proposition. To be honest, I have no doubt that there are representatives of the Christian faith out there that would reinforce that stigma and even live by that pretty explicitly. I just don't know any of them personally, nor do I interact with very many of them. I think that all authentic, sincere, thoughtful Christian people that I know understand that there is meant to be a relationship in terms of God has given us a brain to understand, to be curious, to think, and even place us within a world that almost begs to be studied and understood. And it's part of just this amazing gift, I think, of the world itself, that it actually has physical laws that are predictable, and then the further we go, realizing, that, in the realm of quantum physics or whatever, that when things get really small or things get really big, those laws start bending and shifting and changing. And so just the endless fascination of possibility and what the world is capable of and what our role in the world is capable of. So I think the idea of science education, that was actually my first graduate degree, was in education. And so that was just super fun to be able to inspire the curiosity of your students to think about the world, to ask questions and not take it for granted, that things just aren't necessarily random, but there's a rhyme and a reason behind it if you're willing to look. And we stand with this incredible privilege of being thousands of years in already to the human story, where we're standing on the shoulders of multiple generations of giants, and accumulated levels of knowledge, that I'm not even that smart, but I basically get a benefit from all the smart people that have gone before me. That I know things that the smartest human beings 1,000 years ago would have never known, not because of their lack of intelligence, just because of where they are, in the timeline. And so I think that there is that human responsibility to steward that knowledge base and continuation and growth, that I don't think runs in contradiction to the realm of Christianity. I think it actually goes to the very roots of what it means to be human. I do think there's places where you can fall off the cliff in terms of taking it to places where it's not meant to go, which ultimately are harmful to the human existence and to the world around us. But I just think the basic understanding of whether it's Christian education or if it's the role of science or knowledge that comes, from there into what informs our faith, or even to what that looks like in terms of public policy or civic engagement in life. Like, to me, that there's and maybe the details of it are maybe where things get a little bit more interesting to talk about. But I think it's a beautiful thing that's meant to be held together, and not just separated and as if we're having two different conversations. Hopefully they're integrated really well, and I think they both have something to add to the other.
Yeah, I really think they can too. What I want to do now is get our toes wet in what the Bible says about science and the environment, nature in general. If you have any particular stories from the Bible that you want to bring up, or passages you want to quote, this would be a good time. How would you kind of introduce what the Bible says about nature and the environment?
Yeah. Well, obviously the beginning of the Bible, and Jews and Christians would share this for sure in common, in the book of Genesis lays out the creation account of the earth. And for sure where Christians need to be challenged and maybe even rightly criticized is when we've treated the creation account as if it's a scientific textbook, which it isn't. It's a poetic and theological account, not a geological, account. And so from that end, if you read it trying to answer scientific or modern 21st century questions, you'll be either endlessly frustrated or come up with answers that really aren't you're meant to come up with. But if you read it as it's intended to be written, to answer questions that, quite frankly, science can't, the who behind the creation, is there a who, and what is that person like that actually made this thing? Is it just somehow self-propagated, or was there actually a being that was behind this, some kind of intelligent or thoughtful presence into it? Like that, those questions are answered. What's the meaning of creation? What is the meaning of human life within creation? What is our relationship meant to look within it? Like all of those things are spelled out beautifully in Genesis. And the primary, obviously, relationship that it speaks of in terms of humanity with creation is that there is a separation between creator and creation. Those are two different things. That creation has been blessed by God and it's been made good because God is good and generous in his very nature. And that human beings are meant to stand in between those two realities as part of that creation, but also mediating God's good creative authority and stewardship of the earth. And so the specific command in Genesis 2 is that we would work and take care of this world that God made. And that obviously that doesn't mean exploiting it or polluting it or abusing it. But what it does mean is that there's the idea that even in the creation that God made it good but not perfect, that it was filled with all kinds of potential and natural resources and raw materials, and that humans, by their very nature and design and the minds that we've been given, are meant to somehow work with this natural world to bring out its full potential. And so the most immediate application is going to be, obviously in the original biblical context, going to be agrarian, where we can take the idea of seeds, which planted could feed, an individual or a small family, but if cultivated correctly, with wisdom and with the applied knowledge of soil science and of the climate and irrigation and so on and so forth, we could actually take that seed and multiply it so many times over that it's not only able to sustain a person, but a family, and not just a family, but maybe an entire community of families and even civilization itself. So that humans, the way in which we are cultivating the world and caring for the world is actually allowing the world to support more and more like life, love, relationships, which is what ultimately civilization is all supposed to be about. Not just human life, but the interconnection thereof and the provision for it. So that God made us just a good world and also is intimately working with humans to give us the ability to understand and the wisdom to know how to draw out its full potential, which I think starts maybe in the biblical paradigm of agriculture, but then goes far beyond that into architecture and into art, into technology, into even all the kind of the different modern scientific aspects of real life applications that we know of now, which at the end of the day are meant to serve a greater purpose of helping to promote, like I say, life, love, and relationships in the world. The only problem is obviously humans have a tendency to take these raw, good, amazing gifts from God to draw out their power and potential, but in negative and often even horrific ways at times, So the same, innate human gift that we've been given by God to take maybe the earth and create like a vaccine could also create like a bioweapon. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. It's the same thing, but and to me that's where the scientific and I'm sure there's smarter people than me that could argue against this, but to me that's just where the whole scientific conversation falls flat. It's great about talking about like what we can do, or even how we can make it happen, but the why we should do it, and for what purpose should we do it, and what is the ethics of doing one thing versus another, and like how do we preserve even like what is the essence of what it means to be human and our role in the world, and how do we cooperate with that versus how are we working against that. And to me, that's where the whole biblical, divine, theological conversation comes into place as just absolutely critical, not just a sidebar conversation, because we can either create amazing, wonderful solutions to the crises in our world or nuclear bombs. Our creativity will create something. And the biblical account is if we'll create it under the authority of God and in loving connection to Him, we'll create beautiful things that will cause life to flourish. If we'll do it apart from Him, we're going to create chaos and havoc. And to me, the story is a weird cocktail of humans doing both. I would argue a little more of one than the other, but no one can doubt the just massive potential of humans to do really awesome and really horrible things.
Yeah. Wow, there's so much in there. I want to go back to Genesis because a lot of people kind of talk about the translation of this concept of dominion, the role of humans given by God, the role of humans on the earth. There's a few different translations. Words I've heard, dominion is one, stewardship is another. Can you talk about that translation, what you see the original words mean in context? So it's just clear that the earth was created for humans, that this was a home created for us in order to be able to commune with God and one another. And there was significant purposes of God that were locked into just creating a time and a space for humans to grow in relationships with God and others. And so I think the idea of dominion is that, yes, like the earth is something that humans bear responsibility for. I think where it gets twisted is the idea of working and caring for the world, or having stewardship, or even the idea of dominion gets totally reframed around the idea of who God is and what He's like. Because if you think of having dominion over a place, usually we just think of it like, well, I can do whatever I want with it then. If I have some kind of sovereign rule over it or rights to it, then I can do whatever I want with it. And we almost immediately start thinking that's how we can then justify the objectification, the pollution, the exploitation, so on and so forth, right? But the opposite is actually true, that having dominion actually represents a servant role to really care for and ensure that the thing you do have dominion over is thriving and flourishing. That you're actually giving away your life so that thing can thrive and flourish versus taking away life in order to thrive and flourish your own. And I think that is a human responsibility. And I think that just images straight back into the heart of God, and obviously straight into the Christian message, which shows that ultimate authority and leadership lies for the Christian in Jesus, who was the one that gave away His life for His creation. Didn't take the life of His creation, in order to bless Himself. He gave away His own life in order to bless His creation, which is just radical, and it throws a whole hierarchy upside down. And even the terminology like dominion gets totally, thrown for a loop. So where some people might be able to use the language of the Bible to justify all kinds of negative treatment of the environment, shockingly, it's meant to do the opposite. But like anything, religious or irreligious, you can take things like in the good or the wrong way. And but if you put it in context, there's no way to get around that. Leadership, authority, responsibility are all being put into the category of servant and self-giving and self-sacrifice at the very heart of it. Yeah. So I've heard this term, biblical environmental ethics or biblical stewardship. How would you define that idea?
I don't know how far I could personally go to do justice to that idea, but I think insofar as how the environment goes, humans have an active role in, and it's a complicated role because it boils down to both individual and collective responsibilities, which create an enormous amount of complexity. It incorporates all kinds of socio-economic, geopolitical elements of it, which only adds to the complexity. And so a lot of this for sure flies over my pay grade. But I think that even though I learn environmental ethics, not from a religious source, but just from public school education, and just the cultural waters of, the Pacific Northwest, I think that I think there is a significant crossover, and in terms of like we should just absolutely be mindful that this has been a good gift that God has made and provided for us, but yet we don't own it. It belongs to Him, and therefore we are simply stewards of it, and the way we care for it should reflect our value and worth we have for its owner and creator. So that's where, to me, the ethics come in. And what's ironic is I've heard stand-up comedians that have actually done a really good job of there was one stand-up bit, I won't mention who it's from because he's slightly controversial now, but it was a hilarious bit, slightly filthy in terms of language, but hilarious bit of just how God is going to come back for judgment, and He's looking at the world and what we've done in it, and it's almost like the parents that come home from a weekend away and their kids have thrown a party while He's gone. You know what I mean? It's like, what did you do here? You trashed it. You threw a rager. Why is the polar bears brown? What did you do to the polar bears? It's a hilarious bit, and it's not even from a Christian voice, and it's 100% true. That there is going to be this sense of this doesn't belong to us. We've been given responsibility, but it doesn't belong to us. And how is God going to feel when He comes back to it and sees, what exactly we've done with it? There is going to be some level of account given for that. So that I think that comes to bear. Now, what that looks like, again, the devil's in those details because of all those factors that can make things complicated. But the fundamental philosophy of it, for sure, you can't get away from.
Well, that's fascinating. Okay, so there's this idea called, it's basically, how do we rank priorities in terms of nature?
Yeah.
And there's a few different ways to look at this that I learned about in a class I took last fall term. I guess it was two. So it was fall term 2018. In a class at Oregon State called Worldviews and Environmental Values, which really kind of, oddly, it was the first real eye-opener for me in terms of biblical environmental ethics. I hadn't really heard of the whole stewardship concept before that. So there's kind of these two competing ideas of how we prioritize people versus nature. And there's a few other ways to look at it as well, but the two I want to bring up are homocentric and ecocentric. Homocentric being people come before nature, ecocentric meaning and people as animals as a whole, it all has the same rank and priority. Right. What would you say the Bible says about that?
Gosh. So for sure a big deal in the Bible is the idea that humans are part of the creation, but we're unique from the creation, and you can't get around that. And that might be a place where there's a split between some of the more classical, secular, environmental sort of ethos or whatever from the Christian ethic. That fundamental in the Christian story, the way the Apostle Paul would frame it, of how the story goes wrong, is that we exchange the creation for the Creator. That we've actually placed the creation above the Creator and taken every good thing He's given to us and essentially received the gift and rejected the giver altogether. And so we're just living for the now and the pleasures we can get out of all that's been given and derive every possible economic or personal benefit out of the creation without an acknowledgement for the fact that it doesn't belong to us and it was been given as a gift to us. Therefore, we should actually glorify and give gratitude to the giver rather than just worship the gift. And I think that can go in two directions. I think that can either look like the pollution and exploitation of the good world. I think it can also look like the worship of the good world and the treatment of humans as if we are just animals of maybe more significant, mental horsepower than the rest of the animal kingdom, but we're really no different than it. And so I guess I would probably maybe disagree with the ecocentric idea that human beings do have an inherent life value above the animal kingdom and above the ecosystem. But the only tension you have to bring into that is it's just not entirely an either-or conversation. Like if a child, a baby tiger and a baby human are drowning in a swimming pool, like who am I diving in to save? Like that's not a question for me, like not even close to a question. And I think even for most humans, regardless of spiritual persuasion, based on I think that inner reality by which God has created us, would acknowledge that. I'm not saying that everyone would, but so somehow in the midst of this broken world that is not ideal anymore, because of human mismanagement and what the Bible calls sin, we have to make a lot of complicated choices to somehow manage the eco-health and human health at the same times. And to me, that's where all the biggest dilemmas come in, because you can make all the radical environmental choices that you want. It's easier to do for a middle-class American like me in some ways than it is going to be for some of my friends living in, near the slums in the Philippines or in Cambodia, or in India and so forth, Places where I've been where the idea of environmental, protection might be a really good idea, but economically or other conditions wise, it's a whole different level of priority for them,
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you create conditions where the human life can still thrive without completely degrading the ecological life around it? I don't know that I have all the answer to those things, but it's for sure, like if I had to throw my cards on the table, I would be more into like what'd you call it, the homeological or the
homocentric.
Homocentric.
Yeah.
Yeah, homocentric. But I understand how that can go wrong, and that there has to be a tension,
Yeah.
held. And for sure, those with power or resources or wealth, like maybe those in the Western world, then yeah, like I would argue that we would be in a better position to lead and to serve, so that the whole world doesn't have to live in trash dumps.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to throw in a disclaimer for the audience. I don't think anybody has this all figured out in the perfect balance between, the environment and people. So, we'll just learn from each other, and we'll try to figure this out. But I want to go back to, you mentioned kind of the limits of science.
Yeah.
What science can't do. And you mentioned, I think, a little bit of motivation. Can you expound on that and maybe talk more about what science can't do that maybe religion can, maybe Christianity can?
Yeah, so that would be a hotly debated subject, and depending on whether you're listening to a Sam Harris or a Ravi Zacharias or another smart kind of Christian thinker, you're going to hear them really battle this out. The idea of, can within the natural world itself you find morality as somehow inherently true and present? And I would argue you can find traces of it only because God has laced the world with that, because the Creator itself has somehow laced the ideas of what we call objective truth or reality or goodness into it. But that ultimately morality is not something that science can find under a microscope. In fact, I would say in many cases the opposite. I think when you start looking at evolutionary chains or the strong eating the weak, when you actually look at what goes on in nature, no matter how idyllic we want to create it in our minds, like there's tons of violence, and bloodshed, and it's a very, very violent world. And so I think that importing something externally to the scientific method is actually critical, and I think it has to be based in something larger than just what we call human common experience or common sense. I think that came from somewhere, and I think that there is something deeper than it. And I think that's where the Bible imports the very nature of God into the very fabric of the universe itself. That though we live in a universe that can feel very self-centered and very just survival of the fittest-esque, that the creator of this world is the source of all life-giving, other-centric love in his being that overflowed into what he made in the world and how he made, for sure, humans to live. The fact that we see something so far from that in human experience is explained by the fall from relationship and communion with God, and that humans don't exist in that world anymore. but the reason why we run into burning buildings to save people, the reason why we give to charity, the reason why we do that. Like, you don't have to be religious to consider those good things or to do those good things, but I really believe that only religion actually gives you the source of objectively why we could say those things are good, actually good. I was just in a discussion with an atheist like this weekend, literally, about this. And he was trying to tell me, like, well, we know that racism is bad, and we know. It's like, well, how do we know that? I get that we've kind of culturally moved into that place in the Western world now, but how do we know that? Not with just subjectivity, but objectivity. How do we know that some of us haven't evolved more than others, or some of us are actually more worthwhile than others? How do we know that the intelligent are inherently more valuable than the less intelligent, or those in the nursing home are more disposable than those who are in their 20s? Like, how do we objectively truly know this? And I would simply humbly argue, although I freely admit that smarter people than me could argue against this, but I humbly believe it's because there is an objective moral law giver who is the source of all that is true and good, and because we're made in his image, we have a sense of that. And I don't think we find it under microscopes. I don't think we observe it perfectly in nature. I do think it has to come via revelation. And when we act in alignment, in accordance with it, that's when the world goes a whole of a lot better. It's when our lives go a whole of a lot better. And I think that's relatively undeniable, So anyway, so that's, I guess, like the whole kind of moral and ethical piece. I think that's why it's never going to go away, because I think science will always leave that wanting. And in worst case scenario, science is going to go down trails to finding right and wrong in its own vision. That eugenics and all this kind of stuff could advance technically the biological design of human life really quickly. They just have to murder massive amounts of people to accomplish it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or commit all kinds of evil to do it. So someone has to be able to say that that is evil and why that is evil, even if, like, you could scientifically argue it's accomplishing a greater quote-unquote good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
You're deep into it at that point, and you need something more than science to help you at that point.
Yeah. It's really good. Okay, I want to take us back to the Bible. Are there any good analogies or parables? I know are the thing in the Bible, or stories from Christianity that have a strong message about how Christians view the environment, nature, climate, pollution, anything like that.
For sure, I wouldn't say that it's like the central message of the Bible. I don't think it's like, again, this is where I think you can start to worship the idea of the environment and even care for the environment. And I think you can go off the rails there, and I think many in my particular neck of the world can. But I think that what is clear is that there's all kinds of both commands and narratives about caring for the world, farming responsibly, letting the land go fallow, for years, so that you're not over-harvesting or taxing the soil. And it seems like even in the biblical narratives, there is scientific and agrarian wisdom, agricultural wisdom beyond its years in terms of like what we would only confirm. I've got family that was been ranchers and farmers, for generations, and I would spend my summers out on their farm, and there's things that we still do now in practice in modern, agriculture that you can find actually embedded into the biblical story as commands from God, in caring for the world. So it's in there. Even the idea of not mistreating your animals, like animal cruelty, is in there. So for sure, like, you can't look at the Bible and not see this stuff. It's for sure in there. It can't like overtake the central story of all of life and human purpose is to do this stuff. But for sure, it's when it's put in its proper position in the midst of the central story, then I think it all comes together and works really well. It's not meant to replace your God, but it's meant to be one of the meaningful expressions of your worship to God, the way that you care for His good world. But of course, the Bible just being both written in and experienced by people living in a real world, Know that when you are being overcome by a powerful military superpower and carried off into exile, that how well you recycled the week before is not the first thing on your brain, and so there's other larger concerns going on, yeah, you see the good and the bad and the raw examples, and when people live in the land well and honor God and love God and one another well as they continue to care for land as God designed, things go really well. And when they don't worship and honor God and love one another well, and that also tends to overflow in the way we selfishly care for the world, then things really don't. And God doesn't seem to be very okay with that. So yeah, it's for sure in there. I think an environmentalist would be pretty happy as far as the text goes, for how it's treated. Not to mention that, the end of the story is a new heavens and new earth. It is a recreation. It's a renewal of creation. That the Christian story isn't about like, oh yeah, the world's just going to pot. God's going to throw it away, and we'll all just be somewhere else other than a physical space anymore. That it is actually the very renewal of this space. That this is home and will always be home. And so caring for it actually does matter. And that the hope that we have is actually embedded in a very real physical place called Earth that is home and will be home. And so some of the more modern Western theological interpretations of, the hope that Christians carry of just dying and going to heaven, and that being somewhere in a non-bodily form in a spiritual state elsewhere, means that, well, you literally don't have to care for the earth then. You know what I mean? It's like rearranging chairs on the Titanic. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter. But in the biblical story, if the story is not just the disposal of creation, but the renewal of creation, then it absolutely does, And learning how to live in this world in right relationship to God and the way He wants us to live in this world is actually really important now, because it has all the meaningful implications of how we'll live in it one day forever.
Yeah, whoa. So end times theology is super controversial within the church, for the audience that might not know that. But, you talked about the new heavens and the new earth, and I know there's a lot of different ways to look at that. Even a plain reading, or what you might think is a plain reading of the book of Revelation,
sure,
you can get a lot of different ideas from that about how the end of the world is going to look. Could you, I guess, I don't know how easy this is to do, but kind of summarize the main viewpoints of that in terms of the earth and what the new heavens and the new earth is, what happens to the old earth?
Unfortunately, those are the details that are either extremely fuzzy or missing, that we can't, at least as far as I understand, can't give a whole lot of detail to. And the Bible has just all kinds of information that we would want to know that's missing, but insists all that it does give is what we need to know. And I have plenty of arguments I like to raise, even to God Himself, about, I feel like you missed a few categories here that I would like more of. And you included all kinds of things I feel like we have too much of. But no, it seems to be sufficient for what God and God's purview that we need, even though it fails quite short of all that we might want. And so that would be a great example of that. So how does that interchange work between the world in which we're in now, passing away to give life to a new world that's to come? What of this world carries over? What of this world doesn't? What does it look like in terms of living in an embodied place here when it's renewed without a presence of sin or human rebellion, where creation and humanity, there is no the homo and the eco, like those things aren't in tension anymore, like putting the ecosystem or human life, there's never a choice that has to be made in either or, like both can do just fine, in a better harmonious relationship together. That seems to be evidently powerfully true, but the details of how all that works itself out, aren't there.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good question, though.
For sure, and Christians throughout, thousands of years have tried to figure that out. Okay, I want to go back to actually your childhood. You mentioned that you worked on a ranch a little bit, and you mentioned kind of the the idea of letting your fields go fallow. Is that something you could talk more about? Is it kind of every 7 years?
It was every 7 years.
Okay. Is that something that you guys did, I guess, growing up?
Oh yeah, my cousins, we'd always go out in their fields. They were dry farmers out in northeastern Colorado, so they had just, I don't know, tens of thousands of acres, I think literally just a lot of land. And so yeah, when you're driving through the fields, some fields are just empty, and nothing happening in them. And they would always explain to me like, oh yeah, every few years, you got to because otherwise you deplete the soil of all its nutrients. And if you do that too much, you get a dust bowl situation, which we've been through once and no one wants to go through again, So even American governmental policy helps to reimburse farmers for allowing the land to rest, so that the farmers obviously aren't at financial risk and don't have the economic burden to overproduce the land. So that was all a fascinating thing, that there's actually policies in place to help reinforce that. Now, I'm not debating governmental policy of what should be or is being overdone or this, that, or the other, but yeah, that's a total thing. So once every 7 years was the biblical command, which I think has a theological meaning. I don't know how practical it is. I'm not a farmer to say if that's too much or too little. But yeah, that was the expectation. And it seems to be, as far as I can understand it, and I haven't studied this in depth, but that the people were not always obedient to that command, and so they wouldn't let it rest as much as God commanded. But that even the idea of the exile, of when God's people were judged for all their disobedience, morally and worship-wise and otherwise, that was somehow in correlation to that basically the time of their being exiled was essentially repayment of allowing the land to rest the full amount of time that they were supposed to have let it rest. Wow. It's almost as if well, pay me now, pay me later kind of a deal. God cares about the land, and he's going to allow the land to have its rest. And if you're not going to give it its rest, then he's going to deal with that somehow.
Yeah, okay. I want to talk about climate change. It's a hot topic, I guess, pun intended.
Great. Let's dial down the controversy here and talk about something easy. Yeah.
So I don't want to get into the science. I mean, I'm a scientist, but we're talking about mostly ethics here. What people are saying and what we even see now, I'll just kind of give, I guess, a brief intro, is that climate change is impacting the whole world in different ways, and generally it's impacting third world countries more because they can't adapt as well. They can't just get up and move, or some of them are, but you can't just turn the AC up a little bit if it's getting hotter. If there's a drought in your area, you can't just pay a little more for groceries. You might have to actually leave. So we see that it's kind of a disproportional issue, and there's a lot of other aspects to it as well. But Pastor Seth, how would you, let me make sure I get the question right here. How would you say Christianity, I guess, how should Christians respond to climate change? And that's a huge question.
Yeah, it's a huge question.
You can unpack that any way you want.
Yeah, the hard part, especially as a pastor, is just how many political implications are embedded in that question, And in one sense, it's sad that it is so political, right? Because I'm sure from your position, someone who cares about the science of it, you're like, there's so many issues that are like that. Can we just not make this political and just do as good as we can according to what we actually know, right? Politics doesn't cooperate with that in all kinds of ways. I am not a scientist. You're the science nerd. I'm the Bible nerd, right? And so when I think through a purely biblical lens, I have zero problems with the idea that humans are somehow involved in the change of climate towards negative outcomes in the world. The big, broad umbrella idea of it. Some people I've heard I just don't believe that humans could actually cause this. I feel like these are bigger levers than my SUV could ever touch. You know what I mean? And I'm just I've read Genesis 1 through 3. And I feel no, we actually have a meaningful role in this world, and as we go in the world, so goes the world. And human technology is a concoction in our current broken world of good and bad. It has produced a level of comfort for many, and globally even. You could just say on a general level, the amount of people elevated out of grinding poverty compared to 100 or 200 years ago is insane, you know? The standard of living, the longevity of life, all of that is a byproduct of human technology and science and so forth. It's great. And then at the same time, the means by which we have accomplished a lot of these things, it can be really harmful to the environment and maybe the long-term sustainability of life.
Yeah.
So I think that's where philosophically I can at least get on board with the idea, even if I don't understand or appreciate all the science, but I don't come to it with a political skepticism. I know one party is certainly beholden to it. That's where I do get skeptical, is not in the science of it, but how the science is trying to be used for political ends. What programs are they trying to finance, you know? Because I know for sure, I drive a Prius as an example, and that was an attempt at doing something semi, responsible, in terms of my carbon emissions and whatnot. But I've even read stuff that shows but the way that batteries are produced and all that, it's not as great of a benefit as you think it is. And it's even when you're trying to do a good thing, it's just a question of the pros and cons, the benefits, and the things that are going to be harmful out of any decision. Right. So that's where I get skeptical when people have just these magical solutions that somehow we're going to turn this dial and everything will be fine. I don't believe that. And I also have trouble with maybe the other side, the more conservative side of the spectrum that wants to instantly be skeptical of it just because of who's saying it,
Yeah.
Or just and that's where I don't know how to separate all of their arguments entirely, but I don't come with the base level of skepticism just towards the science part of it. I just carry the skepticism in terms of what are we politically going to do about it? What's actually going to be the most helpful? How do you balance, just like you talk about, the people who are going to be most vulnerable, not only to climate change, but the decisions about how we respond to climate change, which is not going to be me. As far as I can tell, if the world gets warmer, Corvallis is just going to upgrade. You know what I mean? We're going to be great. If you're in the middle of Florida or Mexico or something like that, that's going to be horrible for you. You're going to be in a horrible place, only getting horribler, just hotter and hotter. So there's just parts of the world that aren't going to be as drastically affected by it. Like a rising ocean isn't going to affect me. I've got a nice little mountain range between me and it. Yeah. I'm okay. But of course, in our global economy, we're all going to be impacted somehow. So I think that's about as good of a non-answer as I can give to your question. I understand, but so do I think I have a personal responsibility to the environment? Yes. Do I try to do both reasonable and semi-meaningful things to address that, in my own life? Yes. And then as a pastor, I obviously have to be very careful managing. I've got both sides of the political aisle in my church, and speaking truth. I'm not afraid to do that to both sides of that persuasion, but hopefully pulling out the best of both sides, to come together, to I think represent God in the best possible fashion. And I don't think that's going to be a left or right. I think that has to be a left and right issue.
Yeah, I agree. And for the third chair here, I've been, just being honest here, I've been studying climate change for a solid year and a half, very rigorously. And it is so big and complicated. I don't claim to have the solutions, the answers at all. I've heard a few of the different political solutions. It gets really dicey, especially when you talk about who you want in power and how money is going to be used. Tax dollars at work. It gets really complicated. And like Pastor Seth was saying, I'm not trying to necessarily pick a side here either. I definitely would say we need to talk about it, first of all. We need to talk about the problems, talk about the potential solutions, and hopefully we can find some good, viable solutions in there. But it is really tricky. Pastor Seth, I guess you said you have both sides of the aisle in church, but generally, what would you say, in terms of evangelical Christians, what would you say is the general mood or feeling or sense of the majority in terms of how they think about climate change?
For sure, like evangelical Christianity temperamentally is more conservative. And I say that for sure that it gets expressed politically. I think what people, there's a great book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. And what's brilliant about it is he shows what is the moral base that the left and the right come from. So rather than trying to make an enemy out of whatever side you're not, you actually see it's actually, there is a moral foundation and perspective to both sides that are actually good and helpful.
Yeah.
And so for sure in the evangelical spectrum, there's a mixture. There's more diversity than people realize, no question. We kind of get monolithically blocked in the media as kind of one size fits all, but we're for sure not. But it's fair to say it does lean towards the more conservative side. So I think there can be a very real suspicion of just mass media and messages you're given, like especially when, in terms of mass communication media, it's not like you feel like honored in terms of your perspective or intellect very often. In our cultural climate, Christians are far more to be presented as idiots or bigots or ignorant of some type, shape, or form, And so when that's the identity that you're often feel projected as, it might make you more suspicious of the same sources that are then telling you like what cars you are and are not allowed to buy, and so on and so forth, So that's probably the general bent and shade. But and for sure there's people that would deny the whole idea of climate change or man-made climate change at the very least. But that's probably having way more to do with their political views than their spiritual views. That can be a thing. But I think for the most part, when I think of my church, when I think of people that I interact with, like there's just people who would be hungry and happy to do things that are going to ultimately benefit the long-term sustainability of the world in which we live, especially if it has a justice bent to it of caring for the least of these. No question, there's that. Yeah. I think that there can oftentimes be a very convoluted message about what that means or even looks like. So it makes action on it difficult, Yeah. So I'm not. I guess I'm not discouraged about. I'm not unhopeful about people that are willing to do stuff, and especially maybe more the region of where we are now here in Oregon. I think people are very willing to be mindful of the environment and to do things for it, and like we love our public spaces and green spaces, and happy to support them and appreciate having them, and for the most part take really good care of them.
Yeah. Thank you. There's this one thing I also want to ask you about. There's this new term around the world called climate anxiety. But there's a fair amount of, especially young people, are concerned about the environment and climate change to the point that they are not optimistic about their future. 20, 30, 40 years out, they're thinking it's not going to be a very great world to live in. Or maybe they don't want to have kids or for whatever reason. So there's this, I don't know if it's technically depression, but there's this anxiety at least. And then Christianity is really interesting because there's hope. Like our final home for a Christian, they don't believe their final home is this world as we know it, at least.
Correct. Yeah.
Can you talk more about that in terms of I guess hope and the Christian message and the worldview that we look at environmental issues from?
Yeah. I think everyone needs just to be aware that fear sells and fear gets attention. And in some ways we're programmed that way, Better to pay attention to the snake that may not be venomous, but if it was, would kill you, you know what I mean? And so better that would alert you. And so when you hear anxious messaging, it's just going to attract more ears. And there's nefarious institutions and people out there that are simply just exploiting that reality to gain attention. Like on both sides. Like I don't see that as a right or left issue. Like I'm being handed fear everywhere I feel like I look. So And I guess this is where my role and place as a pastor and my faith for sure come deep into the equation, because the whole idea of that anxiety is massive and on the rise. And we're living in one of the most anxious times that has ever been in human history, where on one side of the equation, you could argue that the world is better than it's ever been and only getting better in many ways, not always, but many. And yet the mental health, emotional health, like even as you're saying, like just there's these issues that just glob onto us. And even though it may not have any impact on my daily life, I'm going to invest all my emotional energy into worrying about a question mark 30 years down the road, you know? Which doesn't eliminate doing action now or caring about it now, but that's a big difference between actually letting anxiety weigh you down to where cortisol and all the stress hormones are being released into your body, to where your lifespan is literally being shortened and your physical health is being degraded as a part of it, where it's actually affecting, even in some indirect and small way, but it's affecting even your personal relationships, which anxiety always does. So those are the things to me that are the real things to pay attention to, that are hugely significant, it's why the faith conversation and even the idea of organized religion is never going away. Because you remove it and you remove the hope that it offers and the security that you can have in the midst of a broken world through faith. Like, anxiety is a pretty logical conclusion to have, you know, for how many factors and things are going on in the world that you have zero control over. And humans left to their own devices does not present a very hopeful equation and picture. So I can completely empathize with the idea of anxiety, and also know that it's only going to increase unless there is some kind of hopeful message out there. And also, like, becoming aware that there's things you can control and there's things that you can't. And climate change is so far beyond any one individual's control. Caring about something and being anxious about something are two very different things. And the fact that people can't separate that anymore just shows the demise of emotional health, culturally speaking, in the West. Which means that we just spike and peak and have these primal reactive fight or flight responses to everything. And the sad part about that is it's contagious. And that living in that place automatically, biologically removes us from our best creative faculties. Like when you're operating out of anxiety, it throws you into the lower portions of your brain, your reptilian brain, that can only handle, you know, life or death, fight or flight or freeze kind of stuff. But like our best prefrontal cortex, frontal lobe kind of stuff, where all of our creative problem solving comes, is when we actually come out of anxiety into more a calm presence, and state of mind. And that's true on individuals and as a collective. So even if you care so much about climate change and believe that it's all doom and gloom, but you're yet allowing it to personally emotionally drag you into anxiety, you're actually only becoming more part of the problem, because you're eliminating your ability to think as rationally and creatively about the problem as you otherwise could. So that to me, the anxiety of it is at least as much, if not way more so, the issue than the actual issue.
Wow.
Yeah.
I haven't heard that before, but I mean, it makes sense. I know a little bit of psychology, and that really resounds with me, because I would say we need to be creative and innovative.
Oh, absolutely. That's the image of God in us that we need on full blast. You know what I mean? But anxiety completely strips us of.
Yeah, and I would say in response to climate change, we need to be those things:
100%.
creative and innovative, collaborative.
That's right.
And the fact that the anxiety is getting in the way of that, well, that's a problem.
And anxiety is going to create the polar reactions. It's either going to create people who are anxious like you, and so less helpful than they otherwise could be, it's fair to say, or it's going to create people that react against that anxiety and say, I can't handle your anxious mess and I want nothing to do with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you're just going to polarize people, and then, you're just not going to be as helpful as you can be.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about science communication, and if scientists can be communicating in any better way to, I guess, Christians, evangelicals. Are there any disconnects there I guess you talked about climate alarmism, and maybe that's not a great communication strategy for a lot of people. Is there anything you can think of, and it's fine if there's not, but is there anything you can think of about how scientists can better communicate?
Better communicate. That's a great question. Well, I wouldn't put this on scientists specifically. I just think the whole world could use a huge dose of humility. And I would be happy to put the lion's share of that on the religious community more than anyone else. I just think that when we talk about big, complicated issues that are going to cross streams, across many different disciplines, like the spiritual and the scientific, that we have to have humility when we come in talking about things that we do know about and being very mindful of the things that we don't. So I'm very mindful that when I preach the Bible, I'm not trying to preach science. I'm not trying to talk about things that I don't know, And I think that anytime I hear science from a Bible teacher or Bible from a science teacher, I want to puke, like both are just terrible. So I as a Christian, I get sick and tired of hearing people lecture me about the Bible or spirituality somehow, from their science perspective, and usually just how stupid, irrational, or irrelevant it is, because they don't do it well. Versus someone who does know the Bible well, but maybe in the same right, like wants to throw down religion, or throw down, science, and maybe doesn't just know well what they're talking about either. So people staying in their lane and being humble when they have to cross out of it, I think would be a huge thing. I would love for Christians to be able to do that more and more, so that we can have a better voice in the civic realm. And I think scientists would do well if they operated the same way.
Yeah. Okay. One of the last things I want to talk about is where you fall in the different scheme of Christianity, because there's a lot of different aspects to it. And potentially, we don't want to be misrepresenting anybody, any Christians that maybe disagree with your view of science.
Sure.
I guess, where would you put yourself under the umbrella of Christianity in terms of denomination, if you would align yourself with one? How would that look?
I think in historical Christianity, I would align myself within Protestant for sure, charismatic stream of Protestantism for sure. That's where you would kind of historically locate me. I think within some realm of general Orthodox, historical, traditional Christianity. So where there's still going to be a lot of overlap between Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant. There's a place where all those things consensually overlap in terms of a historical, traditional Christian faith. But the way maybe where I have a unique, deviation from that is for sure from the Protestant tradition. So I'm not Catholic in that sense, and for sure within that charismatic. So an evangelical is probably a fair label to put on me. Most evangelicals my age don't like being called evangelicals even more, even though we're totally evangelicals, just because it has all the political baggage and connotations attached to it. I don't mind it. I think it's a pretty dope word if you understand what it means in its context. And it's gotten dragged through the mud by a few folks, more than a few folks, and some people have been bit by it worse than I have. So I have compassion for that. But that would be my stream. And so for sure, the Bible is an authoritative source for life for me, and means by which I can know God in an inspired and authoritative way. And that's probably one of the bigger deal issues that would differentiate me in my faith from a lot of people, even within various Christian denominations or traditions.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. As we're wrapping up, I want to ask you basically if there's anything I'm missing. But before I do that, I actually want to kind of reiterate something we've already talked about a little bit and kind of give it a name. It's called greenwashing. Greenwashing, one word. And Pastor Seth and I were talking about this. It relates to politics, but not just politics. A lot of businesses will do this as well. And I would say as society becomes more and more environmentally aware, people start trying to do things about climate change, we need to be aware that groups and political parties will sometimes make themselves appear to be doing a really great thing for the environment. It's oh, we're a green company now or something like that, that isn't actually doing much or anything at all. And I'm not accusing anybody of this. I'm just saying we need to be analytical. We need to look at the data as much as we can from both parties. And yeah, I guess so. My last question now is kind of like, what am I missing? What other questions do you think maybe I should be asking, if any? It's fine if there aren't really any. But is there anything else you want to talk about at all?
I don't think so. I talked a lot, said a lot. I can't really think of any. I'm thankful that there are people like you that think about this stuff and think about it deeply and care about it deeply. That don't feel like they have to let go of a deep and meaningful, robust Christian faith in order to explore this stuff. That's awesome. So I wish there were 1 million times more of you in the world, and even through you, just hearing about some of the other people and groups out there that are thinking like you is really encouraging to me. So I think that's all great, and the church figuring out like what kind of a role it can play. Like the church tradition that I'm in and a part of will always have a difficult time figuring out how and where we take stances that will come off as political, because there are agendas and things we're trying to accomplish in community that can supersede those sometimes, and you have to be very careful with anything that can potentially bring a division point in. Like there's some things that is worth dividing over and some things that aren't, and so even within this conversation there's probably there's things that we could do that would be worth dividing over and things that wouldn't be. And so as every pastor or even Christian leader has to figure out, you have to use a lot of wisdom and discernment to figure out what's what. So but anyway, I'm thankful for these conversations. I think they're needed in our modern world more and more.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I really appreciate your time, and this was a really good conversation. I'm really glad that we could have this today. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.